Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carrie Coogan, Deputy Director of the Kansas City Public Library, and welcome to our signature programming. We hope you are all well and safe. While more than 36 Kansas City restaurants have closed for good amid the COVID-19 pandemic, many more have managed to survive. But what is the future? What lies ahead for the restaurant industry here? In the third and final installment of our lunchtime series, coinciding with KC Restaurant Week, we are pleased to bring you 3 restaurateurs to discuss that very thing. We have former Sava owner Caitlin Corcoran. Corcoran co-owned Sava in Westport for more than 6 years and is now an aspiring winemaker and farmer. We also have Waldo Thai General Manager James Chang. In addition to managing Waldo Thai, Chang has launched Chang Kitchen to distribute his own line of cooking oils and sauces and spices. Cheetie Kumar, a 3-time semifinalist and finalist this year for the prestigious James Beard Best Chef Southeast Award, co-owns the restaurant Garland in Raleigh in North Carolina, and is also on the leadership team of the Independent Restaurant Coalition. And finally, our moderator for today, restaurant critic Liz Cook of The Pitch. We thank you all for being here and willing to share your stories. One last thing, we are taking questions via the chat, so please join in the conversation. And now I'll turn things over to Liz Cook and our panelists.
All right, thanks so much, Carrie. So going into 2020, the restaurant industry really seemed healthier than ever to people looking on the outside in. Some industry groups were projecting an increase in 2020 restaurant sales as late as March. And I think we all know where things went since then. Almost 1 in 6 restaurants nationwide has closed, either permanently or long-term. And more than 2 million bar and restaurant workers are still out of work months since the pandemic began. Just based on those headline statistics, the future for local restaurants doesn't sound especially bright. But at the same time, it does feel like we're living in a catalyzing moment for change in the industry, both good or bad. New industry groups have formed this year to lobby for federal relief. Workers have banded together to speak out against abusive practices, and chefs and restaurant owners have started long overdue conversations about mental health and the unsustainable grind of hospitality work. So today, I'm glad to have our 3 forward-looking panelists to help us answer 2 critical questions for the industry right now. First, what can restaurants, industry workers, and diners expect in the coming year? And second, are there opportunities that we can seize right now to make the industry more equitable and resilient in the future? So I'm going to turn to Cheetie Kumar first. Cheetie is joining us from the future in a sense because it is currently 1 p.m. in Raleigh right now, where her restaurant is based. So Cheetie, in addition to operating a restaurant right now, you're also on the leadership team of the Independent Restaurant Coalition, as Carrie noted. And I suspect some people listening in today might not be familiar with the Independent Restaurant Coalition. So I wonder if you could start by talking about how the IRC formed and what future you're fighting for.
Sure. Thanks for that, and thanks for having me here. The Independent Restaurant Coalition, I believe, formed on March 18th of 2020. I was not in the starting lineup, if you will. I think it started with a group of texts and emails between some restaurateurs in America, and I think probably a lot of communities and independent restaurant owners in every community was realizing how sort of alone we felt. And yet we were all in this together. And I think it was a real spotlight for us to realize that we don't have a collective voice. We all work really hard. Independent restaurant owners are often working 80, 90 hours a week, especially in the beginning of your business. We have a lot on our plate, and we think, we always think about putting our head down and working, and that's what we have classically always preached. And then when this happened and we were forced to lay our folks off, we had no idea what was ahead of us. This was completely an unprecedented situation. a lot of us didn't know how to navigate, the banking system and how to advocate for ourselves among lawmakers and policymakers. So, and I think, traditional groups like the Restaurant Association represent such a huge variety of restaurants. And so you have to start thinking about what is a restaurant. McDonald's, I guess, is a restaurant, but it's really a real estate company. And then my little restaurant is a, locally sourced independent restaurant owned by, a brown woman with not very much culinary experience. So, how do those two, how can they possibly need the same things from our lawmakers, and how can we possibly be having the similar impact on our communities? So anyway, the long answer is that's when we started, and it has grown exponentially. And I think we've all kind of probably learned something about our local lawmakers, how our mayors advocate for us, our downtown coalitions or our community coalitions, and what really it means to be sort of an engaged entrepreneur and an employer, and all of the opportunities that we do have right now when we're sort of like, I think we've been stripped to our bare skeleton, and when we put our muscles and bones back, I think we can do it really deliberately. And on my better days and my better moments in this emotional roller coaster that has been the last 10 months, I feel thankful and grateful for that opportunity. And I'm sure that the other folks, Caitlin and James, have similar experiences.
So could you quickly review what are the major policy changes or initiatives that the IRC is fighting for right now?
Well, the main focus in the last few months, or since we started, is the Restaurants Act, which is a standalone grant, law. I guess it's a bill. Or right now, it's being rewritten. It was introduced in the House and in the Senate. And in the House, it was by Representative Blumenauer in Portland, who was a Democrat, and in the Senate by Representative Sinema from Mississippi. So it has bipartisan, bicameral support. It was part of the original HEROES Act, and it's basically, acknowledging that this is not, going to be a 3-month or a 24-week PPP kind of solvable situation. Our industry is going to be severely negatively impacted for at least 18 months, and I think we're on track to see that. I don't see anybody really predicting, a miraculous turnaround, back to full swing in April or anything like that. So recognizing how we spend our money, the economic impact that we have in our communities, the fact that our profit margins are so slim, our overheads have not gone away. We lost so much inventory. We are the one industry that's really forced to operate at, reduced capacity or no capacity at all. I mean, we're public facing, we're putting our staff in danger. Like, all of those things are kind of addressed by the Restaurants Act. But, we're still absolutely fighting that fight. And we really hope that this next package that's being brought up by the new administration will include specific help that addresses our specific needs. If we're going to see our ability to rehire all those 11 million people, then we really need to be in, facing the new era on our strongest footing that's possible. And then beyond that, we've also discussed one, fair wage, and racial and social equity in our restaurant cultures. But I think that that is definitely a broad industry-wide conversation. But I think we all have to start that work in our own shops and in our own communities, because that looks different. I think the landscape in a downtown New York and Manhattan restaurant is very different than, for y'all in Kansas, or for me in Raleigh, or, a smaller city versus a big city. So, I think just understanding that we can organize and have a collective voice. And I think we all want the same things for our futures. And so, I think we're still kind of writing the mission statement for the Independent Restaurant Coalition, but our main focus so far has been the Restaurants Act.
Okay, thanks for giving that overview. I want to zoom in maybe to the individual restaurant level. James, I'll turn things over to you. So in addition to your products that you're selling as J. Chang Kitchen, you're also the general manager at Waldo Thai, as Carrie noted, and you're a veteran service industry worker. How has the idea of hospitality in general changed for you this year? And how have your relationships with customers changed?
Oh boy, it's been a hard year to say the least. We were actually lucky enough to be one of the few independent restaurants that got approved.
Oh, I think we lost James here, or he's frozen. Give him 1 sec to see if we can reconnect.
The joys of Zoom.
I know this is part of the beautiful problem of virtual.
We run it, unfortunately and fortunately, like a family, so everybody's always in everybody else's business. But at the same time, I personally feel like the old style of running a restaurant and running a brick and mortar is not going to be sustainable in the future. Like, at this point, if nothing else, the pandemic has taught us that you need to evolve. You need to find new ways of generating revenue. It's shown us how important social media is and how much Instagram and Facebook posts do affect restaurant revenue. So yeah, it's been interesting to say the least.
Are there changes that you've had to make this year that you think will last after the pandemic has ended?
Yes, the how should I put it? We actually managed to start a ghost kitchen out of our own kitchen, and that was in itself just one way to generate revenue, because after the PPE loan was done and after restrictions lifted a little bit, we realized that we weren't generating enough revenue to keep ourselves open. So we started to figure out ways of generating that revenue without losing our own identity. And that was one way for us to do it, because we're a relatively new restaurant. We've been open maybe 3 years. No, not even 3 years, like 2.5 years. And the concept that we're bringing forth in Kansas City is something that most Kansas Cityans and most people in the Midwest especially hasn't seen before. We do a regionalized Thai cuisine. We are Northern Thai cuisine, and we actually stay true to the flavors and tastes that we have, that the Chef Pam has grown up in. And that in itself has been a struggle. And we worked so hard to get to the point that the public understands what we're trying to do and supports us, that we didn't want to lose our identity. And that's one way to do it.
Do you mean that diners in Kansas City expected the more Americanized version of Thai? Is that what you mean?
Exactly. And I mean, to this day, we still get the same questions that ask us why we don't have certain curries and why we don't have certain noodle dishes. And as a general rule, it's because we tell people that we are a true to taste Thai, Northern Thai restaurant. And while what other restaurants and what other Thai restaurants in Kansas City are doing are completely fine, we have nothing wrong with what they're doing. We hope them well, but that's not the image and identity that we are trying to put forth.
Okay. Caitlin, I want to bring you in here. You made a conscious decision to step away from a pretty prominent role in the hospitality industry a while back. What would it take to bring you back?
A lot. I think Medicare for all, for starters. I think that's the main one for me. I feel like our society, our systems in the restaurant, a lot of them weren't set up correctly to begin with, but it's more systemic as a nationwide problem in lots of different industries. But I think healthcare is a big one for me, and especially mental health care. I also think equity between the front and the back of house, the difference in wages. I think we need to eliminate tipping as it's rooted in enslavement and our continued oppression of Black people in this country. I also think that there's an epidemic of sexual assault and harassment within our industry. And I think that until some people are accountable for that, we can't really move forward. And I don't really want to be in that environment again.
Yeah. So I know you've written and spoken before about the importance of setting boundaries in industry work, which maybe relates to that last point you made. What kinds of changes would you need to see along those lines?
I mean, I think first and foremost, the issue with small restaurants is that there's just so much work and there's not a lot of help, I think, and there's not a lot of management. So I think first and foremost, like HR, we need to have HR in small restaurants. There needs to be some way to have a collective HR that a couple restaurants could buy into maybe. But the fact that there's not HR makes it so these abusers a lot of times who are in ownership and in the chef or leadership role are not being held accountable, because who would you report to? You would report to your boss, who's the one that's harassing you, the one that's signing your paycheck. So until we can really start to address that, and maybe also like basic line of having an employee handbook. I think a lot of small restaurants open up and they don't even have like the basic legalities like lined out, but also it costs money to have a lawyer look that over. Why can't we have an open sourced format for these small restaurants to be like, hey, you're opening a restaurant? Here you go. This is for everything you need to know in Kansas City or Missouri. Obviously, it'd have to be updated, yada, yada. But I think those are some baseline things that aren't happening, which especially when I've done some programs with Goldman Sachs, I did a business fellowship with them. People in other industries are just like awestruck. They're like, how are you even thinking of opening 2 to 3 more restaurants and you don't have HR yet, and you don't even have a company policy on sick days? And I'm like, that's a really good point. Yeah. How are we doing that? And that's just so commonplace in this industry, because I've worked in this industry now for 20 years. And so I've had so many different roles, and in none of them have I ever been given a job description. So I think there's just some very basic things that aren't happening in our industry, but also it's because we're not supported by the federal government the way that I think other business owners are, specifically in other countries. I also think that there's just lots of things that fall through the cracks because we've allowed them to happen for decades.
That's a good point. And you raise a really interesting, maybe tension there between, I think everyone wants our local independent restaurants to survive. I mean, they're the things that make our city unique and give it color. But as you noted, these big corporate restaurants, the McDonald's of the world, often actually have more structures in place when it comes to being able to keep employees safe. So yeah, that's definitely, lack of resources for independent restaurants definitely plays into that.
And I also just think that the fact that so many small restaurants are started by the creative, myself included. I'm a very dedicated beverage professional. Most people start bars or restaurants because they're really into those flavors. They don't necessarily have a lot of that business acumen. And so to start a restaurant already takes so much effort. Like Cheetie said, you're working 80 hours a week. And so it's like, how could you expect someone to go to the small business office at UMKC and be like, hey, I need some help with this HR problem? No, they don't have time for that. They're worried about the next service. They're worried about hiring the dishwasher that didn't show up last night. They're worried about so many other things that they can't focus on making the company culture not toxic.
So I want to jump in here and remind people tuning in that we will be taking questions at the end of this panel. So please drop them in the YouTube comments, and we'll have some time at the end for all of our panelists to get to as many of your questions as possible. Cheetie, I want to turn to you. Over the last few years, I know more and more chefs have started to speak out about their own struggles with mental health and the unrelenting pressures of the industry, which Caitlin has touched on a little bit. I cannot imagine that this year has made those any easier. Are there any resources out there right now for chefs or industry workers that are having a hard time?
Unfortunately, I think this year has really highlighted the lack of even just the ability for people to have a conversation about mental health. I think we're finally lifting the taboos that have traditionally gone along with somebody admitting that they suffer from anxiety or depression, or even understanding what that is. And I think, to Caitlin's point, restaurant owners, small restaurant owners, aren't entrepreneurs. We aren't CEOs. We don't know what those skills are. We learn on the fly, we learn on the job, and we're always trying to catch up. And I think to a large extent, there are definitely career culinarian and hospitality people in this industry, but there's a lot of people that, might have a restaurant job to support their creative endeavors. And, those, we aren't really equipped to handle a lot of the anxiety that goes along with it. Maybe we haven't been raised to talk about it. And I think it's only now that we realize like we need help. The general anxiety of 2020 may have made it okay to say I suffer from anxiety, because like I feel like this a lot more than I used to, or I've not had to deal with the public, and I realized like how much anxiety I would carry with me when I went into work every day, worried about whether a really rude guest was gonna harass me, and I wouldn't be able to say anything and have to swallow it, and then work for tips, and like I'd get off work and then drink too much because I just needed to like decompress in a hurry. I mean, I think there's so much ritual in a restaurant that is great, but it also can feed into a ritual turns into a habit, and then it turns into a dependency, and all of those things kind of fester. And we tend to support each other on the team. We end up being a little too familial sometimes. These are all environments for a lot of toxicity to just kind of get compounded. And I mean, we're really struggling in our community to like put together a group of like just some resources for physical and mental health, for physical therapy, to not be in pain all the time, because that impacts your ability to be happy. But it's very much, I think there's been a tendency for the federal government to kind of like offload that kind of stuff to states, and every state has different priorities. So I think people in California have a very different experience with healthcare and mental health care than somebody in Mississippi or even North Carolina and Georgia or Kansas. I don't know the particulars of your state, but I don't know. I personally don't know of a national, mental health resource. I know that telehealth has become a thing this year, which is probably going to be a net gain for everybody, but it's crowded and it's hard to find a therapist.
Do you think national healthcare is the answer to those problems?
I think that, yes, absolutely. I think there is no other sort of wealthy society in this world that doesn't have basic health care for people. I'm not an economist and I don't know what that looks like, but we have a Medicare system that's already set up. I mean, there's no reason why, if people have objections to getting better health care than Medicare, and if you can afford it, great, do it. But that doesn't mean that somebody who doesn't should have absolutely nothing. I think it's absolutely criminal for there not to be any sort of system for somebody who graduates from college or doesn't, or immigrates to this country and risks everything, and they come here and they break their foot. They don't even have like a long-term health problem, but it completely shatters their life. I mean, that's absurd. I hope that in 10 years we look back on this and say, oh my God, we were living in madness,
So there's maybe a disconnect here between the world and the culture that industry workers are all too aware of, and what the dining public sees or understands about what it's like to be an industry worker. James, I want to turn to you. I know we've seen shifts in consumer demand over the years for more ethically or humanely sourced meat, or for more local and sustainable supply chains. Do you see customers demanding more ethical standards for industry workers? Oh, I think you're on mute, James.
As in regards to what aspect are you asking?
Like, do you think diners want to see more ethical standards at restaurants? And do you think that's something that might play into their decisions about where to go in the future?
I do think that there is more growing awareness of what happens behind closed doors at restaurants. but I don't think that that awareness has to a point where it's going to necessarily prevent a majority of the public from going to a restaurant. I mean, albeit there has been ramifications on certain actions against chefs and what they do, and I completely support that. But I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. It's just because if you think about it in one way, when somebody wants to go out and dine out, it's almost like an escape. You go to think about it as going to somebody's house, and then they basically clean after you, they feed you, they take care of you. They don't necessarily think about that aspect of the service industry.
Yeah, okay. Caitlin, I guess I'll extend a similar question to you. I mean, do you think that customers can or have an impact here in terms of demanding better standards, or is this something that the industry is going to have to take on its own?
Can I first say that there is a free Casey clinic in Kansas City. If you're in Kansas City and you need some mental health, call 816-753-5144. Also, if you are a victim of sexual assault or harassment, contact Moxa. They are part of the RAIN network, and they can help you with some free counseling for that. I do think that consumers have an impact, but I just think that until there's like real accountability, it's just industry rumors. And I think it falls too often on the victims or the witnesses of the accounts instead of the perpetrators and the abusers to have to like tell the story, and that shouldn't be the case. It's, I think, something that Cheetie referenced that I feel totally in supportive of why I can't work in restaurants again for a long time is the emotional labor in general that front of house workers have to do, and back of house workers, but really front of house workers have to exert themselves so much and swallow so much that like it's really hard to want to say, yeah, I'm going to put myself on the line and tell all these customers that, like, newsflash, I'm a survivor. A lot of people don't believe you. Like, they say they believe women, but when it comes to some of that, they don't actually want to hear the nitty gritty, and they don't want to have to take on that emotional labor of now knowing that story, because it's easier just to go to the cool place, to get the cool drink, to eat the cool thing, than to have to make a stand. I also think that this year, working Wine Harvest for my second time completely, just learning about the workers' rights within the vineyards, it was startling, the fact that we still pay vineyard workers by the bin, which was something that I thought was outlawed in the 50s. Apparently not. So I think in general, most people are just disconnected from the economics of the food cycle, and that includes restaurants. Restaurants are a part of it, but most consumers pay for cheaper spinach. They don't ask why Thane Paulberg in City Market charges so much more for spinach. Newsflash, it tastes a lot better. There's more nutrients in it, but it's not subsidized by the government. So it's just this whole cycle that people just don't understand any of the economics of where their food comes from and how they buy it. And I don't think people can care, because in this late stage of capitalism, it's exhausting. They're just trying to survive another day, get through frickin' 2021. There was a coup last week. Like, there's just too much going on for people to be like, yeah, I'm going to really research and care about where I'm buying this like hamburger I really like, or this taco I'm into, or this pasta dish. Like, they don't care. They want to just eat the food to disconnect, have an experience, and not really have to be bothered with it.
So James, you mentioned a little bit about how you think kind of our current model of hospitality is maybe going to be outdated. I wonder if there are other models you could talk about that might address some of the problems we've been talking about. I mean, is unionization among industry workers an option? Is worker-owned collectives a better idea? Where do you see it going?
I really don't have any answers for that. I don't necessarily, like, as much as I would love and enjoy the idea of actually having a union. The restaurant industry itself, with the workers, it's so temporary. People constantly bounce from restaurant to restaurant to restaurant. People drop out, people drop in. I don't know necessarily that a union in itself would be feasible. God, I don't know. I've after 2020, I can make zero predictions for what the future comes. Like, I mean, we all were happy that 2020 was over, and then 2021 came, and then all that stuff happened last week, and yeah. So I have no idea what the whole future holds, but I do feel like that the restaurants in itself, the old model of where it's the whole brick and mortar model, it's simply without any additional congressional help, especially in the midst of a pandemic, it's not attainable. There's so many things stacked up against restaurant owners and operators, going from costs to customers themselves to supply and demand. Like us at the restaurant, we've hit a lot of hurdles in the past year with supply and demand because a lot of our products are especially like a lot of the seasonings are imported from overseas, and there were periods in the midst of pandemic where we couldn't get certain ingredient for like a month to 2 months, and we were kind of scrambling and trying to figure out how to like make certain things, and that actually affects the menu that we do as well, because without that one key ingredient, you really can't bring forth the flavors that you want. And on that end also, since the pandemic, food costs has jumped ridiculously high. Like I mean, there's certain things that's jumped almost like 80%, such as like gloves and cleaning supplies, sauces, and like imported things. Minimum jump is 30%, and I mean that's really killing the overhead.
Well, that's maybe a good time to think about, what is eating out going to look like, quote unquote, when all this is over. Cheetie, I'd be interested in hearing your perspective here. As a restaurant owner, what kind of changes do you think diners should expect to their experience going out, down the road when hopefully we're all vaccinated?
Well, I mean, what should be and what probably will be are probably very different. I mean, I think, Caitlin addressed the lack of value that people have in the food system in general. Our sort of desire to be wealthy as sort of a goal, a common goal in this country for everyone to have this experience of being rich, right? And I think walking into a restaurant and getting an experience where you're served, you don't have to cook, you don't have to clean up after yourself, you don't have to do the dishes, all of that stuff it's a luxury, but it's not really viewed as that. A lot of people expect to get a lot for very little, and I think it's unrealistic. It's not a sustainable, in any sense of that word, it is not a sustainable way of being. We can't, abuse our planet and our ground and our earth and the people that harvest it and the people that cook the food and the people that serve the food and the people that wash the dishes. We can't minimize the value of that and call it unskilled and just shove it aside. The government has no problem supporting industries like the airline industry or the hotel industry. Well, why is the food system such, sort of marginalized? And even when you look at, the farm, the way farms are classified, farms that grow actual food are considered specialty farms. So regular farms are commodity farms that grow things for making ethanol, and it's not food. We've forgotten that our food comes out of the ground and the earth. And I'll stop with a tirade about that, but it's really important to understand that the very basic ingredients aren't valued in this country. So when we get back to it, and we hopefully have a federal minimum wage that is somewhere in reality, even that will be too low, and hopefully the tip credit and that whole thing will be dismantled very soon. But restaurant owners can't shoulder that expense on their own. I mean, the government has to also recognize the importance of lifting up this entire industry as well. So things going to be more expensive, and they should be. I mean, I think people should really understand, like, if you're in lockdown and you had to make your food every night, you understand how much work that is, right? Just to feed yourself and your family, it's a lot of work. Imagine doing that for 200 people every single night. And it gives you a little glimpse into the backbreaking labor and the emotional labor of what we do every single day. And, you know, well, people like me aren't getting rich. You know, I haven't been paid since March. Like, we're just basically existing so we can pay our landlords and pay our staff, and that's about it, and keep up with our invoices. I mean, we're just kind of keeping the gas in the lines, and that's about it. But at some point when we come back, and we want to do all the right things, and we want to source better, and we want to treat our staff better, we can't absorb that cost. When we were fortunate, if we were making 6% profit, we were like opening inexpensive sparkling wine,
Sure. So in addition to, I guess, expecting higher food costs, I mean, you kind of touched on the issue of tipping, which I know, Caitlin, you raised as well. So Caitlin, I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more from you on this issue. You kind of acknowledged this discrepancy between the front and the back of the house. So which, for those listening in who haven't worked in restaurants, would be like hostesses and servers who are tipped versus, line cooks, dishwashers who may be tipped out, but don't rely on tips for most of their wages. So can you talk a little bit about the problems you see with tipping culture and how you see that kind of creating that difference between the front and the back of house?
Yeah, so when tipping was started, it was literally so that people that had just been enslaved could not make a living wage. We wanted to oppress the Black people further. So they allowed restaurant owners to pay people a different wage if the customer tipped them. However, in lots of places, white people still did not tip Black people. So that was a way to oppress them further. Now it happens that it really has also made sexual harassment so much more prevalent because servers put up with things that they necessarily wouldn't because the customer's tipping them. A lot of the guests don't realize that in Missouri right now, as of January 1st, the minimum wage did raise to $10.10 an hour. The tipped minimum wage is $5.15 an hour. I believe the federal tipped minimum wage is still $2.75 an hour. So people don't realize that. Like, the people that are working the front of house are getting paid a less amount of money in theory because the guests and the customer are tipping them. So the back of house people, the kitchen staff, the dishwashers, if you're lucky in Kansas City, when I left my position of hiring for that, we started people at $15 an hour. However, that was really good. I've been applying for jobs as I'm retired right now. And starting is like what, 10, 12 in a kitchen. I mean, James could speak to that. But so there's this huge discrepancy of if a server walks away with $200 of tips at the end of the night. And I mean, that's also depending on the price point of the restaurant you're working at. It depends on if your restaurant tip pools or not. There's lots of factors that go into it. And so the reality that I feel is that, like, in general, we're putting too much pressure on the guests to pay the living wage of our front of house staff. And we are not paying our cooks enough or our dishwashers enough for all the stuff that they're doing either. No one's getting paid great, I think. But the reality is that guests like that control, I think. I don't think most public understands where it stems from. I don't think that they also realize it perpetuates the cycle of sexual harassment and violence within the workplace. And, I hope that they care about that, but people, Europe has been doing this for years, and people complain about that, that now Americans tip more over there. So it's this whole thing. So people like to tip. So I don't know if it's something that we'll be able to do as one restaurant. And that's why it kind of has to be like a mandate or something that like a collective restaurants do together. And I remember trying to have that conversation with owners in Kansas City, and no one really wanted to do that other than me. And also a lot of service staff is opposed to it as well, which they see it as the instant gratification, when in my poise, I'm trying to see like the long-term effect of just making it a more equitable system for everyone and not just trying to get rich that one night.
So there are a couple audience questions that are related to this that I'm going to bring in a little early because it seems like a good time to talk about them. So one of them is it possible that the industry overall will see some forward movement on the issues that Caitlin brought up due to the rethinking and pivoting that's happening with COVID? And I guess I thought of that question because I know, related to your comment on sexual harassment, Caitlin, I think what we've seen in a smaller scale with mask etiquette with consumers maybe plays into this too. And that right now, servers who are working with people who are dining in are kind of having to play mask police, and it puts you in a difficult situation when it comes to, well, I need to enforce this rule from someone who is essentially subsidizing my wage. Do I want to piss them off? Do you see, maybe let me ask James here, do you see like this being a moment that might engender further change in that direction?
I mean, the mass stories. Oh God, the mass stories. Like myself especially, we've gotten to a point where you have to, it's overwhelming that at this point in the pandemic, people still don't quite understand the mask rules and wearing the mask and how you're supposed to cover yourself when you're not seated and when you're not eating, blah, blah, blah. It's mind-blowing to me. It's one of the daily constant struggles that we, especially in the front of the house, face at work. We actually at Waldo take a very, very firm stance. Like, if you come in without a mask, you're gonna leave. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're the governor. You can get the hell out. Excuse me. But it's it's really that strongly is how we feel, because what the public doesn't realize is that, like, yes, we are under a mask mandate. Yes, the city and the mayor has put this mandate forward, and I personally am 100% with it. But at the same time, the city does not give us any resources to enforce these mask mandates. They basically leave it up to us as restaurant owners. And if, per se, let's say somebody reported us not enforcing the mask mandates to the Kansas City Health Department, we're actually liable for a huge fine. So that in itself, actually, it's one of those, like, we're left with no actual tools, but we're expected to enforce it, and we do. There's been multiple times where we've butt-faced had to ask people to leave. We've gotten yelled at. We've gotten threats of, I'm gonna call my lawyer. Like, that's really gonna do anything. It's been hard, to say the least, ever since dine-in has reopened. But then at the same time, like, we are very grateful to a lot of our guests. Like, majority of our guests come in, they follow the rules, they do everything right, and we appreciate that. But it's always that one or two bad eggs, I guess is a polite way to call it, that ruin it for everybody else.
Yeah. Well, a question in the chat as well said, if tomorrow the minimum wage exception for tipped workers went away, what would happen? Do you think that would have alleviated some of the issues that you're seeing right now? And Cheetie, maybe I'll start with you here.
Yeah, I think, it might be overwhelming for people to think about a complete overhaul overnight. I think, people are really missing the ritual of dining out. And a part of that is to reward your server for great service. I mean, that's just a part of what we do as Americans. But, we, when we reopened we just have outdoor dining and takeout, we realized that we didn't know what we were going to have volume-wise, and we weren't rehiring as many people. So we took it as an opportunity to say, well, the whole tip credit thing is basically you're allowed to pay front of house person who is, who gets tips, $2.15 an hour. And basically that covers their Social Security and Medicare deduction. So the employer is not on the hook to try to get that, right? And then they are supposed to make a minimum wage of whatever the federal minimum wage is, with their tips. And if you do that as an employer, you are not allowed, at least in North Carolina, to mandate that the back of the house gets a share of those tips, right? You can tip pool, but it only has to be among the people that you're getting this tip credit for. So we're not going to take that tip credit anymore. So we decided we'll just pay, every server is going to make $8 an hour to start with. We're doing 30% of our normal volume. And they'll get 70 to 80% of the tips. And then we take the 30%, we split it up among everybody in the back of the house, prep team, dishwashers, line cooks, everyone who's not a salaried manager. And now everybody in the restaurant is making well over $20 an hour. Amazing, right? And I think the financial commitment on our side is pretty negligible. I mean, yes, we're operating in a very small capacity, but we just figured if we're going to commit to it now, then we can figure it out when times are better, right? So I think that, doing something like that, it kind of empowers our front of house staff, because it's odd. It's like undervalued and overvalued at the same time. We don't care enough about you to pay you a normal, like not even a laughable hourly wage, but at the same time, you could be making $50,000 a year and be working 25 hours a week if you work in the right restaurant, right? And I'm not saying that they shouldn't, that they don't, that money isn't deserved, but then what about the cook that's working 60 hours a week and is covered with scars and burns, I mean, that person also deserves to make that much money. It's a big problem, but I do think that there are steps that you can take. And there's an organization in California called One Fair Wage, and they're really addressing the, if you don't take the tip credit, you can still get some sort of payroll tax credit. I mean, these are complicated payroll laws, but they work, and you just have to do the math for your place. And, I think we are going to have to figure out some of the, some bigger restaurants that rely on high volume and low cost. I'm not sure if that's going to be a sustainable model, but we'll see. There's also this opportunity for, it could happen that everybody gets the vaccine, 70% of Americans do, and then all of a sudden, we're back open, and it's like the Roaring 20s again. I don't know. Who knows what's going to happen? But I do think that there's ways for individual restaurants to sort of figure it out and just play out some scenarios, because we can right now.
Thanks, Cheetie. If you're just tuning in or tuning in late, as a reminder, we're taking audience questions now for our panelists, James Chang of Waldo Thai and J Chang Kitchen, Caitlin Corcoran, formerly of Sava, and Cheetie Kumar from the Independent Restaurant Coalition, and Garland in Raleigh, North Carolina. So drop your questions in the chat, and we'll get through as many as we can. So another audience question related to a lot of the things we've been talking about is about health insurance for the industry. So an audience member wants to know, do any of the panelists or their restaurants offer health insurance to employees? Have they looked into it? And what would be the challenges associated with providing that as a restaurant owner? Caitlin, I'll turn to you. I see you gesturing. How much would increase costs if a restaurant decided to offer health insurance?
I could never offer it at Sava because I didn't have enough employee buy-in, because I had under 12 employees and I needed 7 of them, I think, to buy in. And everyone was either on their parents' health insurance still because they're under 26, or their partners had better health insurance at their other jobs. So I couldn't offer it. And then inherently it was because it was too expensive. And the insurance that you can offer, our brother restaurant, the Rieger, offered health insurance to their staff, but it's not great. You can't, it still has a high deductible. I mean, that's the issue with a lot of our health insurance in this country. Too high deductible to actually be usable.
James, you've worked in the service industry in a lot of different capacities. Have you ever had health insurance coverage at one of those jobs?
We actually at Waldo Thai do have a group health insurance. But just like Caitlin said, it's not the greatest health insurance. The deductible is freaking ridiculous. For the ones it's almost to the point, I feel like it's almost to the point you might as well just do surgery yourself with that deductible that we're facing. We have the kitchen knives. I'm sure we have some butcher's twine in the back somewhere. But yeah, I am actually fortunate enough to get health insurance through my wife. She works in a, I like to call it a white people job, where it's like a 9-to-5 in the office. And my whole family's covered, and we're grateful for that. But it's really is hard, especially as a small business, to get enough employees signed up, like Caitlin said, to make it feasible. And then or you're stuck like us, where we have certain amount of employees that are signed up, but the deductible is just, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, Cheetie, how about you? Have you looked into this, and what would it cost?
We've looked into it many times, and it's really expensive for we have a music venue and a bar and a restaurant in the same building. We have a lot of part-time folks and people who, are in bands, and then they come and work for, a few hours, or they go on tour. I mean, there's all kinds of scenarios, but it's, we have given people stipends to pay for, half of their insurance, but in any official capacity, unfortunately, we never got to a point where we could afford it. What we have been looking into is, I think private insurance is just such a racket anyway. I mean, we have catastrophic coverage on a personal front, but there are some clinics here, and I think this model is starting to pop up a lot in other parts of the country and here too, where you kind of have a subscription and you pay $75 or $80 a month, and you can see the doctor anytime you want, and it kind of covers, your basic medical care. If you get sick, you can go in there. You don't have to, you have a doctor. And it's a really smart model. And I think oftentimes you find that those doctors are functional medicine doctors. So they're not just writing you a prescription. They might be looking at your entire health, and that seems like a lot more of a viable option for us, for anybody on our staff who wants to do that.
Okay. So a question on the entire other side of the spectrum here from the audience. Obviously, we need and want some regulations in the restaurant industry. This audience member says you want assurance that the place is clean and the food is safe. But are there any regulations that you think could be lessened or eliminated that would make life easier for restaurateurs? And Cheetie, I might just direct this right back at you.
I think some of the food safety things are great. I honestly, it keeps my staff from getting lazy, and it helps me. I like everything to be, just so, and I'm not going to tolerate things not being labeled. I mean, the regulations. Here's what I think. We have food and beverage taxes. We pay in millions and millions of dollars every year into the county fund in North Carolina, in Wake County. We have a 1 and 1.2% tax on all food and beverage sales. We have nothing to show for that. There's no infrastructure for us to come back and have any input in how that money is spent. There's nothing that can come back and help our employees, or nothing that goes into the city that can provide parking for our workers. Like nothing. I think, to me, it's less about regulations. I mean, I guess as a business owner, I'm just like, it's just a part of life, it's just the way it is. And a lot of times, there's some code things that are absurd, like, automatic faucets, the plumbing department doesn't really communicate with the health department. The health department's like, well, your water doesn't stay on long enough. It's like, oh, this is all I can get. I was forced, I think any industry is going to have that kind of nonsense, but I think it's more about like what happens with our tax dollars and our ability to advocate for ourselves with the money that we've paid into a system.
Okay. Caitlin, how about you? As a local owner, are there, local restrictions or regulations that would have made your life easier if they were changed or lifted?
I think that a lot of people probably remember, it was well documented in the pitch about Savad not meeting the food requirements. I think that some of Kansas City's particular laws, especially on the Missouri side, stand back to how we behaved in Prohibition. And so there's a lot of stuff that has been just on the law books since then that are kind of silly. I do understand why, like, we have the 3 a.m. license versus the 1 a.m., but the food costs, the food sales requirement, at least for my concept, was really hard to meet because we were selling bottles of wine for $300 and Baham frites for $5. So in Kansas City, you have to either do 50% food to liquor if you have a 1 a.m. license, or you have to sell $250,000 worth of food in a year, which Savaz's 725 square feet. So it's quite tiny. And so then that comes into some of the things with the pandemic now. We packed people in there like sardines because that's how much we needed to make food sales and to make requirements for our licensing. And now with the pandemic having to be different, restaurants that are small are struggling more because they can't get that return on the seat investment that like they thought they could. However, I do think that the health department right now is so inundated with Corona because in addition to all of this other stuff we're trying to beat, we're still in a pandemic, y'all. And so I think that if there's anything that was frustrating to me back then, especially as an owner, it was just the disconnect between the fact that they didn't really understand cooking techniques and weren't really up to date with vacuum seal and some sous vide technology. And it was more like, I don't want to kill people. I don't want to hurt people with botulism. I'm just trying to make sure that I can preserve my food and I can pickle things and I can use stuff 6 months from now. And this is a technique that I know can do it. But because of the lack of resources our own health department has, they're still operating on the 2017, I believe, federal mandates. They're not even up to the most recent federal issues. So
2013.
Yeah. See? So it's like these departments are so inundated with all these other concerns on top of restaurants that I understand the need for them, but it does get a little bit frustrating for sure.
I don't know why I didn't think about the alcohol laws, because that regulation is absolutely absurd in our state, and really just has no connection to reality at all. I don't even know when these laws were written. It's inherently corrupt. We just had to-go cocktails starting on December 24th or something. I mean, we went 9 months without being able to sell a cocktail out. When we were doing meal kits, we couldn't put booze in anything. It's just crazy. We pay anyway. Don't get me started on that, but that definitely needs to get overhauled.
Right, and that's how restaurants make money, is the liquor sales. They're not making money on food sales, and they're making money because the markup on wine and alcohol can be so great. So yeah, when you're hindered in not being able to sell it to go, it really does cut into your margins even more.
And this is maybe one area where we can at least give a nod to Casey for doing something right, in that very early in the pandemic, they were able to relax that rule against to-go cocktails and allowed restaurants to provide that. So that's been hopefully a boon to restaurants at a difficult time. We are nearing the end of the hour, so I want to turn to an audience question that I think maybe all three of you could help us shed light on to wrap up our panel today, which is, what can diners do to help our local restaurant scene right now? And also, what kind of behavior do you want to see from us in the future when dining out looks more normal? And I guess, James, I'll start with you first.
Come visit us. Come spend money at your local establishment. Instead of going out to your local Chipotle or your McDonald's or whatever chain restaurant you have, come to your local mom and pop shops like us, because we are the ones that will be the first ones to go. The corporate ones will be the ones that will survive. And another thing that customers can do is be patient. We are in the midst of a pandemic. I want to say almost all the restaurants, especially the smaller ones in Kansas City, are running with a skeleton crew. I know we are. On a Friday night, we currently have 4 people to run our floor, 4 to 5 people. That's it, to run the whole floor. So patience is always appreciated, and we're very thankful for people that are patient. And just know that, we are human. We will mess up. We will mess up your order once in a while. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is. So yeah, that's what I have to say about that.
Okay. Cheetie, how about you? What can we do right now? And is there behavior that you'd like to see from diners in the future?
Well, I think, support your locally owned restaurant. Assume that they're on the brink of closing, because they more than likely are. Support them in the way that they're asking you to support them. They might be offering takeout. It might be a fine dining restaurant that has never done takeout before. And, we're figuring it out. You might not see the same things on the menu before. There is a reason for every decision that we've had to make. We've had to really analyze what will survive in an aluminum pan. I mean, I cannot wait to plate something on a white ceramic plate and, make crudo. Like, we're not able to do all of the things that we really love. And it's a matter of survival right now. So you have to really consider that, there's a reason for why we're doing this. And believe me, we're trying as hard as we possibly can to get to the other side. So if they're asking you to buy a shirt if you can afford it. If they're asking you to buy a gift card or not use a gift card right now, like, please don't bring in a gift card. We really need every sale to like go into our bank account right now. Call your local representative or your senator and ask them to support the Restaurants Act when it comes back, and recognize whatever local or statewide efforts there are to support restaurant workers, unemployment benefits, healthcare for the people. And when we do come back, exercise some patience. We're all exhausted, and we're not probably going to have a break before we have to like open back up and like it's not going to look like it used to. I mean, we might have forgotten how to do this too. So just be patient. Yes, we are human. We get tired. We make mistakes. We're trying to figure it out as well. And as exhausted as you are, we're going to be the ones who are like catering to your joyful night of celebration. We may not get to have that for months and months and months.
Well, I want to touch on that gift card comment because we've gotten a lot of questions from audience members about gift cards this week throughout the panels. And I think maybe it's worth underscoring that, like, ideally, we should all be treating gift cards as micro loans to restaurants right now and not, using them. And I think just to underscore that, I've read about restaurants that have basically turned their gift cards into kind of savings bonds where they say, like, the value of this gift card will increase if you don't use it until October. And I think that just really underscores how close margins are and how difficult it is right now. And so to the extent that we can hold back on those and wait for a more convenient season, I think that's an easy thing for diners to do. Caitlin, same question for you.
I think that buying like hot sauces that your favorite restaurant sells or favorite condiments is something that I've been trying to do, like getting them in bulk. Also,
like J. Chang Kitchen.
Exactly, like J. Chang Kitchen. Chili oil is delicious. But also merch. Merch is something that restaurants have already paid for. So if you can buy a t-shirt, if you can buy a bag, if you can buy a pen, that's stuff that they need to get out of their inventory. So I think that would be really helpful. And I think, patience in general, now and when we come back from this pandemic, I think some of my worst interactions with people had been because not only they didn't have patience, but also the level of entitlement that some diners had. So I think that in general, after 2020, I think a lot of us, especially white people, need to be taking into account our privilege and our entitlement and what that means and looks like when we go out to eat and how we treat people.
All right. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much to all three of our panelists for a really stimulating conversation today about where we're going. And for those listening in, in addition to everything we've talked about today, we're speaking on the occasion of Restaurant Week. Whether you're participating in the official Restaurant Week or doing your own Restaurant Week by just going out and getting takeout from an independent restaurant you love, this feels like a perfect opportunity to do that. Thank you again to all three of our panelists. Thanks to the audience for tuning in, and go get some good carryout, folks. Thanks.
Thank you. Be safe.